All right, guys. Anthony with Austin Dark Weapons Guild here. Once again, our new location, Vigilante in Austin. Today we're going into a little bit more cloak work. This time looking at Fabris's Rapier. One of the first things I really want to highlight between this and the previous video is the different lengths of weapons we're talking about. With the previous video, we were doing Myers Rapier, Myers Side Sword, which again has a simple knuckle bow in front and a ring engaged, but otherwise nothing else. And as you can see, it's a much shorter weapon than the Rapier here is. Also with the Rapier, you have full convex hilt and lots of fun stuff, but primarily the difference that can affect the use of the cloak as a side weapon is the length. One of the first things Fabris talks about is the general overview of the cloak and how to use it and what it should be. He doesn't give us a whole lot of what size, what shape the cloak should be. It's kind of assumed as a cloak at the time. So if you're the historian, I'm not completely looking to that. But it does give us a few general ideas that kind of highlight the things that it shouldn't be. So, and how not to do it. So one of the first things he says, interestingly, is completely counter to what we talked about last week with Meyer. Meyer, remember, we had our cloak nicely wrapped, and it's kind of becoming this soft buckler transitioning type weapon. With Fabris, he says not to do this. This isn't enough to protect you from a cut with the Rapier at the length and the distance that you're going to be engaging with it in, and just is prone to leaving your hand struck as a target. It also takes away the entire defensive capabilities of the cloak. What Fabris wants us to be doing as we're going through this is we want it loosely held at our hand down to our elbow. And we can look at the images. There's a little bit of bunching on it, so this width I have is probably pretty good. We also don't want it too long. Like I don't want to grab at the very end of the cloak and do this, because probably the only time in this book Fabris acknowledges that you may be a human fencer. He says we should be holding our hands out at the height of our head, and should we get tired, that's when we can let it go down. And we want this to come down. We don't want to get this, like you can see here, I'm going to step on it and trip and mess things up. So in this rested position is kind of where we want the cloak, maybe just barely grazing the ground, sitting on the floor. So when it's up, it's still covering most of things. And as I go up and lean into position more, you can see I get a whole lot more coverage, a lot more utility from the length of it here. So something to keep in mind is you don't want something too long. You want, like when you do stop and take a rest, you want it just about at the ground. And kind of working from there, you can start finding that length, finding that placement. He says you want it, again, up to that elbow. You don't want it all the way up the arm. We're not, playing at vampires or Dracula or whatever. It's kind of loose, held out here. A few more interesting points about this before we dive into some more of the esoteric uses he has. We'll talk about some of the plays next week, maybe the week after, depending how good they are, how much you get into them. But really kind of framing and posture and things like that. So I'm going to put the sword down for a minute just to kind of make this a little easier to deal with and play with, and I'll recenter this nicely. So I've got my cloak, the length of my arm. He says a cloak is useful because it has three features. One is its length, coming all the way down to cover our legs. The other is the width, which I thought was interesting because it really kind of highlights that, if you had just a kind of rope that was just as long, it doesn't have enough volume, it doesn't have width, enough mass to kind of prevent the sword strike from coming through. So you really need something wide. And this kind of highlights how long you want it to drape. And I kind of think, like, if I bring this all the way out, it definitely could be too long. But I think that bunching here, and that's kind of what you see in his plates and his images in the later plays, this little bunching, this width is what helps give it the mass to actually stop strikes. According to Fabris, a cloak will basically protect your entire left side, right? We've got enough drape that our feet are going to be covered, and any cuts coming down at my legs, as you can kind of see, from the opposite side, this will get tied up and bound through here. The other interesting thing is it says that this will stop thrust as well. And this is when he talks really specifically about how to hold this angle, how to hold the cloak. So if I really make sure I fix this right, have this out the right way. Here, I always want this folded front edge pointed at my opponent. So you can kind of think of, if I make this finger sticking out here, that should always be towards my opponent. And Fabris says that this is what's going to give you enough drape, cover, and protection. He said, have you aware that because this is a flexible item, that yes, it's going to move a little bit. You need to make sure that when it comes in and strikes, you're not directly behind it, so I can't just drape this at my ribs. But if it's out, if it's draped, the flexibility is going to help protect the cloak from being damaged, but it's also going to kind of just twist and bind and tie up the other person's weapon. And I don't believe I have a sharp rapier, but I'm definitely curious to kind of play with that, because he definitely says in that early section of, if a thrust comes in, it's going to basically not pierce. And you can rely on this to take not only cuts low, which everyone kind of assumed, but also thrusts. His counterpoint to that is, though, you do not want to hold the cloak perpendicular here, because this doesn't have that same depth, the same tying up capability, and a thrust will kind of puncture through here. But if you hold things at the angle and kind of use it as Fabris describes, this allegedly becomes good enough to deflect thrusts and kind of shunt them off to the side. So I thought that was especially interesting, kind of playing with this idea that, yes, obviously low cuts are going to be stopped, but the idea that a thrust kind of going through this mass, this tangle, should be enough to deflect the point and keep yourself safe. And again, Fabris was very key on first stock getting hit, always making sure you can retreat at any moment, keeping yourself safe. So if he's saying that this, as long as you're not, again, holding it square like this, so that point comes right in, this will be enough to twist and bind, whether from your own motions as it catches and snags, or just purely by the design of how you move things. And again, that may not be true of this piece of flannel I'm holding. The cloaks he may be talking about may be much heavier, much thicker, multiple layers of linen or something else. So again, better scholars than I will find more info on that. But the other interesting thing he talks about, using this arm to defend before I start doing paired stuff with my sword again, is he's very precise about how we should move this arm, how we should engage things so we don't, A, create a bigger opening than we need, or also, as you can kind of see as I'm doing this, wind up blinding myself and not being able to see. If Fabris wants us in this kind of long position, hand basically just below my eyes, just so I can see over, I should be moving, not my whole arm, not moving from the shoulder, because that's a big slow motion. And you can see if I kind of start moving my shoulder to open this up, all this becomes really open. Where if I move from the hand, this stays tight and protected. So he's very emphatic about making sure you're moving from the hand, or moving from the elbow to only move your hand, and not moving your elbow and moving from the shoulder. So keeping your elbow isolated, move from that elbow. It gives you enough of that distance you need to deflect and displace. It's a much smaller motion. It's a much more efficient motion. It also, you leave yourself more protected if they cut around, change other things, and working from there. So now working with the sword, Fabris interestingly talks about assuming we're right foot forward. First, he wants the cloak and the sword together. And he even says, and I'll have to look into this more, that we want this by the point, right? So as you can see from here, I'm really stretching this out, but that's counter to Fabris, and I'm really pulling this arm back. So I'm not really certain how he kind of compensates between those two features, those two facets, whether this becomes a much more refused guard, the sword's coming in, or I kind of keep the arm tucked back, so I keep everything tucked in, because this is something we see much later with this kind of retracted guard. But he's very clear that we want to keep both of our weapons together. And that terminology as well is interesting to me, because that's how we think about things in 133. And it looks like we just lost video. maybe, maybe not. Video came back. That's something we hear about in 133, this idea of that we have two weapons. Even though this is a defensive thing, it's still a weapon. It's replacing a dagger, things like that. But we want to keep them kind of locked together, no matter how that situation becomes, that my weapons are much more effective, much stronger when they are bound, whether they're bound at the middle, bound at the point, even bound at the hilt. Keeping these together is what's going to keep me far safer than if I try to fight in this kind of disparate, one hand does one thing, this hand does something else. He really wants us in the habit of, I'm here, my weapons are together, how can I start moving, taking advantage, taking those openings? Last thing, talking about tonight, is that he kind of favors, and we'll talk about this more next week when we talk a little bit more about guards, stances, positions. Single sword, sword in one hand. We always kind of assume the default standard is this: right foot forward, my sword is out, I'm braced out here, I've got that hand up in the back, kind of working from this. So yes, we can, with a cloak, just be pressed out, maybe it's pulled back, maybe it's around, right? There's lots of options to start playing with, which we'll talk about next week with different plays. But he also gives the option that you can be left foot forward. And that this position, while it's terrible with sword and dagger, because this knee is super exposed and there's not a lot I can do to protect that front, my left knee in the front there. With the cloak, if I'm out, if I'm covered, I can drop a little if I need to. Now that knee is completely covered, completely protected, and there's no danger of that anymore. And really being able to kind of switch your guards standing here is a completely unique thing to Fabris's cloak section, at least, where in other weapons he says, or at least highlights, your dominant leg forward, your dominant arm forward, your reach, your leverage, all those benefits. Here he's saying with the cloak, because you can just protect that entire left side, that now you can start playing left foot forward and give yourself a whole bunch more options and things to incorporate and utilize and kind of almost exploit from your opponent. He does do a little bit of cloak throwing, does you a couple options with it. He kind of tags on at the end, but since that's what everyone kind of likes the most, we'll talk about those real quick. Hence the PAL, hence the thing. For me, the interesting takeaway here is more the target than the how and the what. Like cloak throwing is just gonna be purely do it a lot, get your reps and your practice in, something you can do with any target you want. He highlights one kind of coming from here, where you just kind of take it off your shoulder and throw, and following after. He then has another one where he talks about acting like you're going defense properly with it, as so, and then you throw, and then stabbing through with a cloak. He even goes as far as with that one to say that you can, right, if I throw this up, I can stab my cloak and bring it in that way, and really kind of using this as a shield to kind of hide my actions, hide my intentions, and really controlling the visibility of the fight. He does make an offhand comment that there are instances, specifically with new fencers, who wind up kind of covering their own face with the cloak, and says, just, you need to be aware of what you're doing. You can't just pick this up and start throwing it around and expect it to work, but you really need to have practice with this. The last one that I thought was interesting with the same throw mentality was talks about kind of grabbing it and throwing it, but throwing it to kind of hold on to it. So you can really almost whip here and follow through, but that way you keep the cloak, right? It's not just a straight up throw and where it goes away, but he says explicitly throw the bottom, hold it from the bottom corner of the cloak, which I wonder if there's more control there, if it's something to do with the top being heavier or harder to move. Again, I clearly am just playing with a blanket effectively, so not as much utility insight there. But that idea that you can sit here, whip it out, pull it back if you don't want it to, and just being able to come out, and then when you want to throw it, making sure it's going where you want it to blind your opponent and play with things from there. So I think that's everything I was planning on talking about tonight. So next week we'll pick a couple of the plays, work through some of those some more. I know cloak stuff isn't really talked about very much, isn't really highlighted. It's definitely its own esoteric concept and not super applicable. It was interesting. I found that in the beginning of his section, Fabris kind of said, the cloak is there. We talk about the cloak because sure, the dagger might be more useful, but daggers are being outlawed. And what that fully means, why dagger would be outlawed and not swords, again, I haven't done that history research into it yet, but it's an interesting concept that you always have a cloak. You're not always going to have a dagger. So being able to fight with the cloak that's always on hand makes a lot of sense and is a much more useful training tool, more useful practice tool than learning to fight with a dagger you're not always going to have. At the core of this, though, everything comes back down to being good with sword in one hand. And if that is something you want to play with the Rapier especially, we have those videos that have been starting out on Wednesday nights. Quick, short videos going through the Fabris plays one by one. Otherwise, guys, if there are comments, questions, feel free to reach out, email, Facebook, YouTube, etc., etc. And hope everyone has a good weekend. We'll be back on Monday with some more longsword. Thanks.